If you've struggled with overthinking, I know exactly how you feel. My name is Helen Garcia. This is a newly rebranded podcast called Mind. Now, I've currently been going through probably my most favorite entrepreneurial book I've ever read called Let My People Go Surfing. If you've ever listened to the Founders podcast, I highly recommend it. As an overthinker and introspective person, I struggle with being an outsider and feeling like my introvertedness doesn't really leave room or capacity to make something big or make something great. A lot of the things are essentially in my head and in my mind. And reading through Yvon Chouinard's biography of Patagonia, how Patagonia was made, has given me a sense of perspective. So much of life is driven by this sense to get somewhere faster or get successful faster. But it took Yvon Chouinard 13 years in business to eventually create what Patagonia would become. And in the process of that, they really did struggle financially in the first few years, rebranding from a climbing company to an outdoor company. Today's episode is how 13 years of business building before Patagonia allowed Yvon Chouinard to become who he is today. Yvon Chouinard's journey with Patagonia is a testament to his unwavering resilience and mental fortitude, forged through his personal struggles, an outsider's perspective, and his unyielding commitment to his values. His early life experiences laid the groundwork to the psychological tools and principles he would later utilize to navigate the tumultuous path of Patagonia. So the first bullet point I just want to share is that Yvon Chouinard had what I like to call an outsider's perspective. Chouinard's formative years were marked by feelings of pervasive isolation. Growing up in Lisbon, Maine, amidst a French-Canadian community, and later he relocated to Burbank, California, he faced bullying due to language barriers and cultural differences. This sense of being an outsider cultivated an innate curiosity and self-reliance. His struggles in public school and subsequent transfer to a parochial school, Catholic religious school, he continued to feel disconnected, which later pushed him towards nature, which was a refuge that nurtured his independent spirit. My parents transferred me to a parochial school where I was able to get more help from the nuns. My report card from that year showed D's in every subject. The language and cultural differences, you have to remember that Lisbon, Maine was primarily French-Canadian speaking, made me a loner, and I spent most of my time off by myself. Before the other kids in my neighborhood were even allowed to cross the street on their own, I was bicycling 7 or 8 miles to reach a lake on a private golf course, where I hid in the willows away from the guards and fished for bluegills and bass. Later on, I discovered the urban wilds of Griffith Park and the LA River, where I spent every day after school gigging frogs, trapping crawdads, and hunting cottontails with my bow and arrow. He later goes on to say, "High school was the worst. I had pimples, I couldn't dance, I had no interest in any of the subjects except for the shop classes. I had a, quote, attitude and was always in detention. For being a troublemaker, I often had to write lines like, 'I will not, 500 times or so. I learned at an early age that it's better to invent your own game. Then you can always be a winner. I found my games in the ocean, creeks, and hillsides surrounding Los Angeles." Oftentimes when we think about mindset, we remember some of the most challenging moments in our lives and how we've overcome them. Loneliness. Sometimes in our lonely hours, we tend to discover what it is that we naturally gravitate towards. And from a really young age, Yvon Chouinard had a really clear love of nature, how it's formed him, how it made him feel at peace. It actually reminds me a little bit of Kurt Cobain and how he came to his own perspectives about life before he started Nirvana. He talks about after his parents' divorce, he really gravitated towards the Washington music scene, how he spent most of his time alone and really developed a point of view about the world and just about life in general. So it really reminds me a lot of Yvon Chouinard's early life. Point number 2, rebellion and value clarity. Yvon Chouinard's rebellious nature was not just a defiance against societal norms, but a pursuit of his authenticity. His disdain for corporate bureaucracy and traditional business practices stemmed from a deep-seated belief in environmental stewardship and sustainability. This contrarian mindset drove Patagonia's ethos, making the company's mission a reflection of his personal philosophy: to conduct business without compromising the planet. This really takes place in the first few pages of the book. I love this intro page because it really does talk about the heart of Chouinard, how he literally was a reluctant businessman. He did not want to do corporate business at all. Here it goes. I've been a businessman for almost 60 years. It's as difficult for me to say those words as it is for someone to admit being an alcoholic or a lawyer. That's how intense he is, y'all. He goes on to say, I've never respected the profession. It's business that has taken the majority of the blame for being an enemy of nature, for destroying native cultures, for taking from the poor and giving to the rich, and for poisoning the earth with the effluent from the factories. Yet, business can produce food, cure disease, control population, employ people, and generally enrich our lives. And it can do these good things and make a profit without losing its soul. That's what this book is about. Like many people who had their formative years in the 60s in America, I grew up with disdain for big corporations and their lackey governments. My values are a result of living a life close to nature and being passionately involved in doing what some people would call risky sports. He loves climbing. He loves being outdoors. That's what eventually forms Chouinard Equipment. This is back to Yvonne. My wife Melinda and I, the other contrarian employees of Patagonia, have taken lessons learned from these sports, from nature, and our alternative lifestyle, and applied them to running a company. My company, Patagonia Inc., is an experiment. I love the humility here. It exists to put into action these recommendations that all the doomsday books and on the health of our home planet say we must do immediately to avoid the certain destruction of nature and collapse of our civilization. So Patagonia, in its essence, takes business as a way to preserve and to nurture humanity's earth. So earth is what sustains us. He says nature is what keeps life afloat. And throughout the writings of this book, he creates climbing equipment as a way to go against European ways of thinking. All the time, the climbing gear was European. The soft iron pitons were made to be placed once left in position. The European attitude toward climbing was to conquer the mountains. If you tried to take out and reuse the iron pitons, which is the things that were used to climb, the head would break off. We American climbers were brought up reading the transcendental writers like Emerson, Thoreau, and John Muir. You climb the mountains or visit the wilderness, but leave no trace of having been there. So this is the origin of Chouinard climbing equipment, where he starts creating equipment that's lighter, better for the earth. These are essentially the building blocks of what eventually becomes Patagonia's mission, which is educating the public on sustainability practices. He's really big on not overdoing it or overusing the Earth's natural resources. And you see this a lot, his striving for quality in his early childhood. You can tell that he was really influenced by his dad from the first few pages, even from the start of page 4. His admiration for his dad, where he says, The Koch brothers and the Donald Trumps of the business world are heroes to no one except other businessmen with similar values. I wanted to be a fur trapper when I grew up. My father was a tough French Canadian from Quebec. Papa completed only 3 years of schooling before he had to begin working on the family farm at the age of 9. When he was 10 years old, he was chosen by his father to go to Maine with him and begin working in a mill. In later years, he worked as a journeyman plasterer, carpenter, electrician, and plumber. Not bad for a third-grade education. In Lisbon, Maine, where I was born, he learned to repair looms at the Warumbo Woolen Mill. I believe I inherited his love for hard physical work and an appreciation of quality, particularly of fine tools. One of the profound memories of my early childhood was seeing him in the kitchen next to the wood-burning stove, drinking a bottle of whiskey and proceeding to pull out some of his teeth, both good and bad. So his dad really carried on this love of working with your hands, using fine tools, being a master of his craft. It says that his dad has worked in a lot of blue-collar jobs while he was growing up, and Yvonne really did grow up in a blue-collar family. The third point I want to bring up in Chouinard's approach to entrepreneurship is really rooted in this personal experience. Not only is he an avid climber, but he comes from a family that really loved working with their hands. So his craft is prompted by him being the customer first. His hands-on involvement and first-hand understanding of the customer's needs comes because he had his own needs. That number one, he had an outsider's perspective, meaning he always felt alone. And that eventually prompted number two, his rebellion and his value clarity. When you're so hung up on your own personal moral compass and not necessarily associated with comparing yourself with other people, you can then become your own customer. In business, I hear this about Steve Jobs as well, that he was so obsessed with making the back of his phone and computer as clean as the outside of the product. And Yvon Chouinard really cared about quality, sustainability, doing things out of necessity and born solution, as opposed to doing things just because it was satisfying to him. So there was a sense of service to the earth that he's always had. And I'm just going to read a passage from this text in page 21 of the book. We redesigned and improved about every climbing tool, making each one stronger, lighter, simpler, and more functional. Quality control was always foremost on our minds, because if a tool failed, it could kill someone. And since we were our own best customers, there was a good chance it would be us. Our guiding principle of design stemmed from Antoine de Saint-Exupéry, the French aviator. Have you ever thought not only about the airplane, but whatever man builds, that all of man's industrial efforts, all his computations and calculations, all the nights spent working over drafts and blueprints invariably culminate in the production of a thing whose sole and guiding principle is the ultimate principle of simplicity. It is as if there were a natural law which ordained that to achieve this end, to refine the curve of a piece of furniture or a ship's keel or the fuselage of an airplane until gradually it partakes of the elementary purity of the curve of the human breast or shoulder, there must be an experimentation of several generations of craftsmen. In anything at all, perfection is finally attained not when there is no longer anything to add, but when there is no longer anything to take away, when a body has been stripped down to its nakedness. So Yvon Chouinard was really inspired by this French aviator's need for constant refinement. The rock climber becomes a master when he can leave his big wall gear at the base, when he perfects his skill that he can climb the wall free, relying only on his skill and features of the rock. I also learned Zen as a blacksmith, forging my steel batons 8 or 10 hours a day. I'd grab a baton, bang on it, put it back in to reheat, and grab another, never crossing my hands or wasting energy with excess movement until the work had the fluidity and grace of Zen archery or a tea ceremony. At the end of a long day, I could stare at an old rusty oil barrel and see it just gleam and glisten like a billion tiny rubies. I love Patagonia. I love Patagonia because it's clear on its mission, it's clear on its identity, and I do 100% believe that it's clear because its founder had a really clear identity. There wasn't an ounce of running away from who he was or a questioning of who he was, and I really do believe that it was forged from his outsider's perspective and his development of self-reliance. And I don't think that everyone has had the ability to have the amount of introspection that he's had. His innate curiosity was born from an early age. His self-reliance was born from an early age. As a result, this goes into point number 4. He had an innate ability to develop psychological tools for overcoming challenges. And I'll just read to you some of my observations and key points from this. Number 1, he had adaptability. His ability to pivot from blacksmithing climbing hardware to establishing a global outdoor brand showcases his remarkable flexibility. And I just want to read a quote from the book that really identifies this point, where he starts to realize that climbing equipment can actually deter the earth, and he decides to pivot. It started down the path of becoming an environmental villain. Art equipment, he says. The popularity of climbing, though growing steadily, remained concentrated on the same well-tried routes in leading areas such as El Dorado Canyon near Boulder, in the Shawangunks in New York, and Yosemite Valley. The repeated hammering of hard steel batons during both placement and removal in the same fragile rocks was severely disfiguring the rock. I'm going to just fast forward a little bit here and just talk about how in 1970, Yvonne writes that he finds this rugby shirt in Scotland. He says, I bought myself a regulation team rugby shirt to wear, thinking it would make a great shirt for rock climbing. Overbuilt to withstand the rigors of rugby, it had a collar that would keep the hardware slings from cutting into my neck. He goes on later to say, I began to see clothing as a way to help support the marginally profitable hardware business. At the time, we had about 75% of the climbing hardware market, but we still weren't making much of a profit. And by 1972, he takes over this abandoned meat packing plant next door to renovate the old offices into a retail store. And he gets more ideas. He says, in the loft one day, I decided to make myself a pair of bomber shorts with a double seat that formed enormous back pockets. Essentially, the entire process of making clothes was a way of serving himself as a customer, and the challenge of not making a marginal profit in climbing equipment and also realizing that it was deteriorating the very landscapes he loved to come to allowed him to adapt. And so he had an intrinsic motivation. Rather than chasing financial success, he was driven by a passion for nature and adventure. And so he uses the rugby shirt not to play rugby, but because it helps him with climbing. And then he wanted to make a pair of bomber shorts that would eventually continue to get sold as a major staple in Patagonia called stand-up shorts. So after he decides to make himself bomber shorts, he goes on to say, after hard use and about 10 or 20 washings, they were broken in and pretty comfortable. They soon became our second big clothing seller. We still make stand-up shorts, but out of softer material. So constant iteration and constant mastery. He says, our intent was to make clothing for those rugged, southern Andes Cape Horn conditions. it's been a good name for us, and it can be pronounced in every language. And so throughout the book, if you're watching on YouTube, I just want to point out that most of what's in this book, especially in the very early pages and throughout, he really takes tons of pictures of his times outdoors, the climbing equipment he thinks is going to help him. And a lot of it is purpose driven and also very, very tethered to just helping the environment. He viewed Patagonia as an experiment, and he embedded environmental activism into the very DNA of his company in order to transcend any sort of profit. And, I continued to look into it, and I found out that Chouinard has actually turned Patagonia into a nonprofit, converted a lot of the company's revenue into a trust. And so Patagonia is also geared as an education business outside of also being a retail business. And so I just want to share that the reason why I've really been interested in Chouinard is because as someone that started a business before and wasn't really driven by the income or the profit of a business, and even to this day, I didn't become a therapist to make a lot of money. I did it because I really do enjoy clinical work, and I enjoy seeing people transform. And there's a certain ethos that comes with that. And I think that in the narrative of business, we've become so hyperfixated with numbers and numerizations that we fail to realize that business can become an opportunity to serve the greater public, to educate the public in what we want to do. And that's essentially my goal for Mind. It's unpacking the mindsets, the psychological tools of the people that have come before so that we can live a purpose-driven life as opposed to a greedy-driven life. So if you found any value from this podcast, please click subscribe. I've really been inspired by the Founders Podcast, David Senra, and I want to continue to just share some of the valuable information that I've gained from books, from readings, from trainings I've taken, and just reflecting on some of the bullet points and lessons that I take along the way. So if you can share this with a friend, if you've found that a friend can really utilize this, please click share, subscribe to this podcast. I'll see you soon. Bye, y'all.